I published right after I graduated from a PhD because I realized the only way I could get a job really was to actually publish. No, I mean, the first thing I published was the past and present article on the crowd in the Iranian politics. That was my interest, sort of, it from the past and present type of approach to Iranian politics. That came easily because I'd done much of the work for my dissertation for that. By pure luck, one dean at City University was also a fan of past and present. So when he saw the article, he liked it and he hired me to teach. But that was the only way I got a teaching position. It wasn't due to Columbia.
Did you say that you were introduced to past and present while at Oxford or later when you came here and you were at Columbia?
No, I was introduced in Oxford, yeah. And my advisor, actually, a tutor in Oxford, was a member of past and present. He was not political, but he was very much a student of Christopher Hill, and he had that approach towards history. So I basically sort of, he was encouraged also for me to go and listen to Christopher Hill's lectures.
Did you ever work with Christopher Hill? No,
I went to a lot of his lectures. You know, in Oxford, you would have open lectures. Anyone could come. And I also met him a couple of times outside, but he was not my tutor in any way.
But he and the whole past and present group must have inspired you, because the crowd in Iranian Revolution, which I have read and like quite a lot, it just fits. If there is one journal that I would say this should have been published, is past and present.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, there's also another link. I was already interested in past and present before I came to Columbia, but one summer it just happened that George Roudet was lecturing at Columbia. I attended his lectures there. And again, there's a sort of oral history is important. George Roudet could not get a job, academic job in England because of his politics. So he basically used to lecture elsewhere. And lucky for me, he came to Columbia at one time. So I attended his lecture. And again, that stimulated me to talk about crowds.
Any feedback, any response after you published your first essay, The Crowd in the Iranian Revolution?
No, I mean, that led to, I don't know if people asked me, but it led me to do actually a shorter piece on the crowd in the Constitutional Revolution that came out in Iranian Studies, I forget, a few years later. And of course, that topic has remained with me because more recently I did one on the crowd in the Islamic Revolution. So it's the same theme that comes up.
So there is a line to past and present, to Roudet, to Christopher Hill, and an interest in revolution and crowds, and then linking it with Iranian history from the perspective of the people, history from below. I want to use this as a segue to your methodology in writing history. And also, we can't talk about the 60s in England and not talk about E.P. Thompson's book and his presence, and probably another line of inspiration or influence in your work. Would you care to address the issue of methodology in your approach to history? How much of it would you attribute to this deep-rooted leftist, Marxist writings of Roudet, of Hill, and probably of Thompson at this point?
And even E.H. Carr.
And of course, E.H. Carr, the red historian.
No, I mean, I would distinguish E.H. Carr from the others, but the names you mentioned basically are all past and present group. So if you look at the editorial board, it started actually early in 1952, but the height was 60. You have George Rude, you have Christopher Hill, you have Hobsbawm, E.P. Thompson, a number of others like Kiernan, which did actually non-European history, but are forgotten. But all of them had this approach, which I would call Marxist with a small m. Some of them had been among the historical study group of the Communist Party before 1956. But after Hungary, some of them had left. Some of them still remained communist, but some were actually Marxists in a loose sense. There were even people who were not political, but their approach was very much the approach of looking at what you said, history from below. I think Eric Hobsbawm or E.P. Thompson coined the phrase of not looking just at history from what the rulers did or the generals did or the state did, which was the traditional view, but looking at it at some socioeconomic point of view of what happens from below. Right. So basically expanding the parameters of history from the top surface to society, and not simple economics, which would have been the traditional Marxist way of looking at mode of production, but looking at how basically the social structure affected the political structure. So there you have, I think, a very much a common grounding of the past and present. But I think what is important there is they never lost sight of the political arena. They never actually gave up the political interest, which in modern day historians often the politics is left out. And that, I think, misses the crux of the past and present school.
I think this is a very important point. In a way, Rude and maybe Christopher Hill were well informed about the Annales school, which is also interested in history from below. Lucien Febvre introduced the word. Yeah. But in the Annales school, the emphasis on politics is not as marked and as salient as it is in past and present and British Marxian historiography, correct?
I think you have a very good point, and this is a very distinguishing feature between past and present and Annales, and I would say the strength of past and present lies here. The two schools were actually at the same time. There was a lot of contact. I've discovered that a lot of these past and present historians actually would often go to Annales conferences, so they knew what was happening in France. But there is underlying it very different approach. What the Annales school is looking at, as you said, is not so much politics. They called it the longue durée. Okay, by long, they mean really hundreds of years, even 1,000 years. They're not talking about what happens in a crisis or like a French Revolution. They're talking about a glacier change over decades, centuries. And this gives it a different perspective. They're interested in continuity. I mean, what makes a country's history continuous often for them was geography, climate, which now, of course, becomes much more topical because of climate change. But for them, basically, the history of France was a continuous, basically, stream of continuity, while the Marxist school was much more interested in change and explaining change. So they were interested in revolution. Annales school was not. And interestingly enough, the major French historians who were interested in the French Revolution were not so much Annales. They actually are closer to the past and present school. So like someone like Lefebvre or Saboul on Sans-Culotte, if you read them, they're closer to the English Marxist school than the Annales school. So someone like, for instance, Lefebvre's work on feudalism, it's very good. And I think someone like Hobsbawm was a great admirer of Lefebvre's feudalism. But to distinguish what he found different is that when he was looking at feudalism, he was looking at conflict between serf and landlord, while Lefebvre was looking at connections and contacts and interrelationship between serf and landlord. So that led him to look at feudal society as a continuity, while for Hobsbawm, feudal society was inherently basically unstable because there was this contradiction. So he would be looking at peasant revolts.
Right, and we are talking about Mark Bloch's feudal society.
Yes, sorry.
Right, before Febvre. But
yeah.
He was executed, so he didn't make it to the 50s.
Yeah, he was executed in 1944. But already before that, you can see he's looking more at a long duration and continuity.
That's a very important point about the relationship between British historiography and the French Annales School that was kind of slow to be accepted in England, correct?
Actually, I was surprised because at that time in the 50s, I wasn't aware of the interconnection. It's only recently I was looking at the biographies of some of the British Marxists, and they were in fact very close contact with the French.
Thank you. This is very important. Thank you.
So, Ervand, you said that you would categorize E.H. Carr differently than a group of historians we talk about. But E.H. Carr was, one can make the argument that he was an important part of the debates on politics of historiography, right?
Yes, I mean, when I was teaching historiography, I would start with E.H. Carr, but I think I would put him more as a critique of traditional history and the last of the traditional historians, as opposed to the first of the modern historians, either annals or past and present. Because if you look at his book, What is History? It's basically showing basically some problems with traditional history. And this is what caused the basic controversy. And this is why he was seen as sort of a radical troublemaker. In fact, if his approach was much closer to the traditional historians than they were willing to accept. But he was asking questions which past and present and us annals asked, which the traditional historians often try to avoid.
But so, the main question he asked was a sort of fundamental to historians' orthodoxy, right? This was objectivity, the issue of role of the writer. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it's very much those questions he was raising, which historians tried to avoid in the past, as if they wrote history as if it was basically a narration of what happened in the past and you as accurate as you could be without asking primary questions about what are you asking? What are the questions? Are these questions significant? But the reason I say he's a traditional historian, he was still basically focused on the political arena. I mean, his first work was about Versailles and the treaties after World War I, the politics of appeasement, basically politics from above. It's true at the end of the book, What is History? He tries to expand it. He says, but his own focus, his own writing was basically on history from above. And you can see this very much, and this is seen as the main Achilles heel of his work, his multi-volume book, which is incredibly well researched on the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union, basically looks at it from above, the winner's point of view. And here is, I think it comes in with the approach of history. And this is what got him into trouble with people like Isaiah Berlin. His argument was that historians, we have the hindsight of history. We know what happened, okay? There's no point of speculating what should have happened, what could have happened. If Cleopatra's nose was somewhat different, would this have happened? He's arguing, we know there was a Bolshevik revolution. We know that the Soviet regime survived the Civil War, survived NEP, survived World War II, and he begins to write the history of the Soviet Union in the late 50s, 60s, when the Soviet Union seemed stable, had survived all these things. So his question was, how to explain the survival of this regime for so long? So this led some philosophers like Isaiah Berlin to claim that he was a determinist, as if somehow he was looking at history as a machine that was going to lead to an eventual destination. That was not his agenda. His agenda was, we know what happened, let's try to explain what happened. So this became a big polemical dispute between him and Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin accusing him of being a determinist, where he was not at all. He just said, his argument was, we know what happened, let's try to explain what happened. He's not excusing what happened. He's basically saying, we know what happened. But for Isaiah Berlin, who had been suffered from the Bolshevik Revolution, this was actually an impolite or an obscene question to say, why had the Soviet Union existed? This was beyond the realm to even pose the question. So it became a political issue about the Cold War rather than history. So I think that way, E.H. Carr became mislabeled as a determinist, somehow following Hegelian point of view that history was going to end at some point, where he was really actually saying that the obvious thing that we know what happened, let's try to explain it. And this actually, I mean, it's actually even, you can say, contemporary for our own study. Some people think that the Islamic Revolution was sort of something abysmal, should have happened, and therefore if you try to explain what had happened, you're trying to actually justify it or legitimize it. Well, the historian's point of view is that you know what happened, let's try to explain it.
That's interesting. That I'm interested actually in this debate, E.H. Carr and Isaiah Berlin. And in fact, recently I read a very critical review of E.H. Carr book by Isaiah Berlin, and my interpretation of how his critique of E.H. Carr was on actually role of the historian. Berlin basically accuses E.H. Carr of being a sort of extreme determinist in a way that he doesn't think that historians have any agency outside of this longer process of historical development. I have to think about this, but in a way, I sort of feel that I think I can claim and say that I have read almost all of, certainly most of your work. I sort of, first of all, I see you more as a social historian than, say, political historian. Not that there is no politics in social history, but the way you write your prose, the way you position yourself is much closer to E.H. Carr. Am I wrong on this, or how do you respond to this comment?
No, I mean, I think the E.H. Carr, another, I think, strength of E.H. Carr is that, what questions you raise about the past is basically grounded in your own time. You're asking the questions.
Yeah.
And so the metaphor he has, I think, is a very good one. You have a mountain, Okay. The mountain doesn't change its shape, but where you're standing on from what angle, what height, the shape of the mountain may look different. So the facts of the past may not change. History doesn't change, but how we perceive the past is very much dependent on where we are. So I think when he raised the question, why the Soviet Union had survived was a legitimate question in late 50s, 60s when he was writing. But you fast forward to the present, we know the Soviet Union collapsed. So that question obviously is not significant now. He would be one of the first to say, yes, you have to then, obviously my approach of looking at it just from the politics of who was in power is limited. There must have been something that I missed that was going on that weakened the system, and the system collapsed eventually. So historian is always should be ready to reassess or even re-question the questions from their time, because things change from how you look at the past. It doesn't mean the past has changed. It's just your questions and how you perceive the past change. And one of the mentors of past and present, R.H. Torney, had the phrase that the past reveals to the present what the present is capable of seeing.
Exactly. And that I was about to ask you that this is really what past and present mean, right? I'm simplifying it, but we are only able to see the past according to where we stand, present where we are. That, in one way, in a positive way, justifies each generation should write the history of the past.
Exactly.
Right? So we cannot say, history has been written, but the challenge that some people are raising nowadays is that if you take E.H. Carr's argument a little and stretch it a little, go a little extreme, it becomes very close to some postmodernist approach to historiography. That is that there is no difference between what happened in the past, objectively speaking, and what we desire to see. In other words, blurring entirely the distinction between fact and fiction or history and fiction. I know that I heard a talk that you gave at Columbia, and you described yourself in this respect, a traditional historian. That right? And of course, these are in your writings. You do all your best. Spent all these years in Foreign Office archives, because you can't be believing that make history as we go, right? Is it legitimate to criticize E.H. Carr and say that he was probably a pioneer, or he laid the ground for some of these more extreme postmodernist approach to historiography?
The term postmodernism didn't exist when he was writing, but I think his arguments are very non-postmodern. For him, history facts exist in the past. And that's why he uses the metaphor of a mountain. It's solid, it's there. You can't go and mess around the shape of them. So the question is how you perceive it. And that's where the subjective element comes, or with the present comes into the past. But he would not be into the notion that any interpretation is equal. You would have to basically, I think also this is, among all historians, for any explanation, you need to have counter explanations, and then to be able to weigh the different ones and see which one is actually more valid. So you can't say, well, any interpretation is equally valid because it's all subjective. and therefore the past is really a blank screen. You could put anything on the past. That's basically a negation of history once you take that modern, postmodern position.
And on this, E.H. Carr and Isabel Berlin agree, right?
Yes, but I mean, I think where they differ is, I think it's more on philosophy rather than history, is that Carr basically says we know what happened. For Berlin, it says if you know what happened, then you're being determinist, which is, I think, sort of a non-argument. We know, there's no way of not knowing what happened. And I think, I mean, Isaiah Berlin always acted as if it was very objective, very just looking at facts, narrating the facts. He also was actually very subjective himself. So some of the writings he did on Russian thinkers, he tended to sanitize them to make them more acceptable, the ones he liked. So some of their racism was dropped from his analysis. So again, E.H. Carr would say, if historians who claim they're purely objective, you have to be careful of that. You have to look at the historian before you look at their history.
I think that is really his contribution. I remember, that the book, What is History, was always very popular in Iran, certainly in the 70s. When I was at the university, this was a major publication, and we would all read and discuss it. It was an eye-opening to me, of course.
Thinking about when Tarni was mentioned and the notion of the past revealing to the present what the present is capable of seeing, I also have another quote that Professor Abrahamian has highlighted by Christopher Hill, who stressed history is about rival explanations of the past. And E.H. Carr is very much about this rivalry and non-equity of every explanation. So very different from the postmodern idea of there is nothing solid about the mountain. Here, apparently, both with past and present people and with E.H. Carr, and I'm not sure about his connection to that journal, rival explanations, but not equal explanations. I think that's important to emphasize, and that's a marked difference between Carr and the postmodernists. To a very large extent, he is not concerned with language. He is writing before the linguistic turn, right, in the 60s, even though the linguistic turn was taking place, but he is not into it. Would you agree with that? And then I would have a question about your work, your own work, and how, and we didn't talk about E.P. Thompson, again, History from Below, the idea of the working class, when we talk about Iran. And if I may say, I think your work is social history as well as political history, and very much concerned with political questions, not less than social questions. Because you, again, write about revolutions, you write about the state. The state is a big thing for you, right?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I think you hit on the right thing, nail. Past and presence, basically, here is more than E.H. Carr. E.H. Carr was not really interested in history below. He's much more interested from history from above. Past and present is much more looking at history from below, but not just purely history below, but how that affects politics. So for past and present, what are the significant questions to ask are things that relate to political realm. Okay? I don't mean political purely on who's prime minister or who is king, but what happens in the political arena. And so that there's always in their work, which is the strength of their work, there is this connection or attempted connection between the social economic realm and the political realm. And a lot of social historians now have divorced that separation. They look at purely at society, not linking it to politics. And I think that misses a lot which the traditional historians were, I think, were careful to always have some focus on politics. And this question comes to significance, for instance. If you're looking at a micro part of history, however interesting it is, the question is, does it have any significance? And it usually has significance if it has some impact on politics or relations to politics. But just describing something, narrating something, doesn't give it any significance. And I think a lot of history, it's not only in general history, but in Iranian history, is on descriptions of narrations of the past, rather than asking significant questions about the past. So here, I think there's another member of the past and present who is actually very crucial to the group, is Lawrence Stone, who wrote on the English Revolution. He actually, before he died, he talked about the separation between antiquarianism and history. For antiquarianism, he meant more traditional history where you just narrate the past or describe the past, inspect something of the past, an artifact of the past. That he calls not really history, but antiquarianism. And a lot of history that we get nowadays is, I would say, antiquarianism, because it doesn't ask any questions, significant questions about the past. And for past and present, for H. Carr, I think for a real professional historian, there has to be a question about the past to raise. And that's harder thing to do than just to say, we're looking for questions. Because once you say, I'm raising a question, then is the question basically a valid question? Is it a polemical question? Is it basically a rhetorical question, such as, was Reza Shah really a puppet of the British, and dismiss it as that? Or you're asking a serious question about, what was the significance of Reza Shah to Iranian history? Then the problem comes, you have to have the materials to answer the question. Because if you're going to make a valid argument, you have to have the information. You can't just cook up basically speculation about what happened. You have to have data. And that's not always easy. In fact, a lot of ancient history, medieval history, gets into the area of lack of information. We're dealing with debris of obliterated societies. So one can speculate indefinitely about, the Achaemenids or the Sassanids or the Parthians, but to have real arguments, you need information. So that's why it's easier to do contemporary, more modern history, because there are more information there. And then the question is significance, as we came to. What is the question you're asking? Is it significant? And you have to be always aware that what is significant is dependent on when you're asking it. It changes. Question we ask now in 2023 is different of what 20 years ago people asked, or what 20 years from now on people will ask. So a historian has to be always prepared to change their interpretation. That doesn't mean the past has changed. The mountain hasn't changed. It's our perception of the mountain has changed. In that way, I think, yes, Carr is very similar to past and present, although he's not part of the group. And I think that he's not part of the group because he was really not really interested in history from below, social history. He was very much still a traditional historian dealing with the political realm, especially diplomatic history.
what I meant when I said that from my perspective, you are more of a social historian than political historians. That is exactly what I meant, for instance. To just say that your work engages or involves history from below is partly true, but you haven't really worked on, say, peasantry in Iran, which certainly earlier was very important, still is somehow important. It is probably, as you said, is because politically they haven't played any significant role. I understand that. But in my mind, this is exactly what social historians do. They do history from below, but they pose questions that is very much relevant, intimately relevant to power relationships. That's why gender issues become important. But there are many other questions that you can fit within history from below that sometimes anthropologists, for instance, involved in, but they don't have political significance. And so this is how I see you work. And this is how I see, if I want to say, the legacy of past and present for today, it is.
You brought up the significance and the importance and the centrality of asking questions. And we are not talking about factual questions, right? We're not talking about yes-no questions, as you said, because there's lots of factual questioning going on in Iranian historiography. What year did so-and-so die? Was it 421 or was it 420? And then we read 10 pages that it must have been 420 or one or the other. But these are not the questions you're talking about, correct? You're talking about questions embedded in arguments, embedded in social contexts. And I think this would help a lot if you would care to comment about what kinds of questions you ask in your work and how it is related to the kinds of questions that you were trained to ask by people such as Keith Thomas or the past and present Hill, Rude, E.P. Thompson, Carr. What kinds of questions historians ask and what kinds of questions you ask, right? Not just factual questions.
The question you raise is very pertinent. I think the strength and I think what the relevance still of past and present, this is, 70 years after past and present started, is that past and present wasn't interested in just narrating the past. It's more interested in analyzing questions about the past and to ask the questions that have to be significant. And the significant questions are very much embedded on your time when you're asking the questions. So these things are still remain, I think, the core of past and present. And for them, the significant questions are basically not just events or what happens on the political surface, but in society and history from below. Now, since past and present, of course, you've had whole turns in history, turn towards semiotics, turn towards culture, mentalities, turn towards a world history, to turn towards basically looking at things such as witchcraft, which is also part of sort of mentality. So these are turns that you turn to postmodernism. So there are many turns that is always spins the historian's mind. There have been so many turns. But after you put aside all the turns, still, I think the core of history is very much what past and present was arguing, that you raise questions, arguments about the past. These arguments are not definitive. They're not fully, basically, answerable. They're the best you can do. Then you have to evaluate the various counter arguments to see which one makes more sense. And you're always willing to reconsider your arguments if new facts come in or new ways of seeing the past. So that still remains there. And I think for me, as a historian influenced by past and present, I still think it's the significant questions are important. That doesn't mean that only politics from below is important. What happens at the elite level is also important if it has consequences on the popular level. So I think it's nowadays it would be in history wars of the 70s, it would be crazy for a historian to say, oh, well, political history is not history because it's not looking at history from below, or the counter for a political historian to say, oh, E.P. Thompson's history is not history because he's not looking at politics. I would say that if to have a significant question, it has to have something that relates to eventually to the political realm. If it's purely issue about, let's say, a micro level or individual, or something that's social that has no other impact, then I don't think it has so much significance. It may be interesting for an antiquarian to be interested in that artifact, but to relate it to a political significance, there has to be some connection. So that's why, I mean, I wouldn't say, well, some history is not history because it doesn't deal with history from below. I think a question, for instance, what were the causes of the coup of 53? It may sound like a political question. It is a political question, but it has wider consequences. I'm not looking at it history from below, but it has consequences on people from below eventually. So it does have a political consequence. So in that way, I would say there's a bridge between that type of political history and past and present.
So to use your mountain metaphor, which I like, is that, so there are some historians in Iran whose argument is that our mountains are very different from these E.H. Carr's mountain, is that this whole issue of Iranian exceptionalism that I'm sure that you're familiar with, that what we are discussing here, past and present, or these debates among historians that started from late 50s, are really about Europe or the West, depending on the context. And the Iranian context is very different. In other words, we have to sort of craft a particular methodology for approaching Iranian history. For instance, some of the arguments are that, discussion of social class or ethnicity, those kind of issues do not work in Iranian historical context. How would you respond to that? How would you critique this particular sort of approach of Iranian exceptionalism, which, by the way, from my perspective, comes very close to Orientalist approach to history of Iran?
Yeah, I mean, I think the social, economic, or the history of Iran also takes into account culture. I mean, this is where E.P. Thompson's work is very valuable. And it actually is, I think, in Iran, it's been translated and it's pretty well known. Why? Because he looks at culture, popular culture, and how basically English working class culture had features it had. Now, the question of exceptionalism, every country claims it's exceptional. And the question of class, you often find that, well, the British traditional historian would say, oh, well, class may exist in France or in Germany, but not in England, because in England, our class concepts were different and so on. So every country would like to differentiate themselves as being exceptional. The question is, in what ways is Iranian history different? And obviously Iranian history is different because that's why I don't buy the world history type of histories that are fashionable nowadays, because each country does have its own history, and that history has had a different culture. But to say that somehow common sense or history rules don't apply to this country because they're different, they're exceptional, this then becomes actually Orientalism. Somehow the Iranians or the Arabs are different people, so you can't apply similar rules of logic or understanding. So anything we know from other countries' history is not applicable because Iran is very different. I think that's basically a way of also closing off any type of fertile discussion about history. And it becomes a sort of a nativism. Who decides actually what is unique about that country? That becomes a way of actually closing off any type of criticism of it. And you find this, of course, during the Shah's period, when a famous French anthropologist was invited to Iran to study peasants. And he basically then came up with the notion that actually the land reform had not succeeded and the peasantry were not satisfied. He was promptly deported from Iran on the grounds that, being French, he couldn't understand Iranian culture, Iranian history, and therefore he was not suitable to study the Iranian peasantry. It's a way of silencing people who disagree with you.